Build professional skills this semester with Adobe Creative Cloud and create standout work both in and out of the classroom. Save big on professional creativity tools. Students get 65% off Adobe Creative Cloud, including Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, Acrobat Pro, and 20+ creative apps. No matter what project you're working on, Adobe Creative Cloud apps can help you take it to the next level. Visit adobe.com/student to learn more.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. One of my favorite investigative journalists in the country is Gerald Posner. He has a unique ability to, if he comes to a different conclusion than the one I've come to, he has a unique ability to make me feel like a fool because he lays out how he got to where he is based on facts, based on logic, based on reason. And the other thing he does is he's able to take subjects that I never dreamed that I had an interest in and all of a sudden make them interesting. He is killing it on Substack. He's a best-selling author. He's written many books, including Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. And I just read the most interesting piece that he's done on digging into the records of the Nazi doctor Mengele. We're going to get into that in a minute, but let me welcome back to The Other Side of Midnight, Gerald Posner. Gerald, it's been a long time. It's great to talk to you again.
It has been, Frank. Great to talk to you again.
You know, I want to focus with what you're doing on Mengele and your recent column on your hunt for his records, but I can't avoid asking you about this because of your work on the opioid overdose epidemic. You've covered this more extensively than anybody, and people can see the work in your book, Pharma. But some great news came out last week showing that the rolling 12-month U.S. drug overdose deaths have fallen pretty considerably. Looks like it's fallen about 10%, and it might end up, when all the data's in, falling a bit more. The one thing that I haven't seen in much of the coverage is an answer as to why these drug overdose deaths have fallen. You know this issue better than anybody. Do you have an answer?
You're asking the key question, Frank, and even the public health officials that I've spoken to were surprised by the numbers, the amount of the decline, and they didn't expect it both in non-fatal overdoses and in fatal overdoses. They haven't had a public health intervention or stopping the flow of drugs at the border that you would say, there it is, that's the reason why it's happened. Now, the only thing to remember is these stats are really good, and I'm happy to see them, but they're still higher than the overdose deaths before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we went up to new highs. The levels went up 35% during the pandemic of people dying from drugs. And now we're coming down. Maybe we'll be at the pre-pandemic level in another year. So we're still at high historic levels, but we're in the right trend, but nobody's quite sure why we saw it on this year.
One of the things that we've talked about in the past is in the news once again because of President Trump's promise to open up these JFK records if he gets elected this time around. That's the Kennedy assassination. You've written extensively about the Kennedy assassination, including the book Case Closed, that was 30 years ago, in which you make a strong case that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. A lot of people listening to this program have never bought the official story of the Warren Commission. I'm wondering if you can, in a Reader's Digest version, explain why a lot of that skepticism about the Kennedy assassination might be misplaced.
Well, I shared the skepticism that a lot of your listeners have. When I started to research the case 32 years ago, I was convinced it was a conspiracy, probably involving the mafia. It was no way that it was just Oswald alone. And only when I did the work for 2 years did I come to the unshakable conclusion that the only assassin that day back in 1963 in Dallas who was shooting at anybody and hit anybody was Lee Harvey Oswald. The question then is, was he part of a conspiracy or not? And that's the great challenge for history. In the end, I don't find any ties from Oswald to the mafia. I don't find any ties to the CIA. But Jack Ruby killing him 2 days later means we're never going to have a settlement on that. And we should have released these files, Frank, decades ago. It's a disgrace that the government has held on to any files at all about the assassination. The American people have a right to know what happened in the murder of a president, just as they have a right to know now what happened in these failed assassination attempts on Trump. And the Secret Service is holding back records from the congressional inquiries on this. It's absolutely infuriating.
Why on the Kennedy front, and I'll ask you about the Trump front in a second, but on the Kennedy front, why have they been holding back these records, in your opinion? You would think any national security implications of things that were going on 60 years ago has long since ceased to be an issue. What's, in your opinion, what's the real reason?
Well, I would think so, too. We're talking about 5,000 records of the millions that have been released that are still being held either with one or two words redacted or redacted entirely. And let me tell you some of the material that's being held back. So the CIA says that in some instances, they still have sources that are retired. They were in their early 20s back in the early 1960s. They're now in their 80s. They may be Mexican government officials or former government officials or federal police officials in Mexico City who assisted the CIA back in the 60s on getting information. And the disclosure that they had worked for the American Intelligence Agency would not only harm them, but their families. So that's possible in a few instances. In addition, I'll tell you what else is being held entirely. The tax records of Lee Harvey Oswald. The 1040 tax records of Jack Ruby, believe it or not. Tax records are sacrosanct. I guess Trump's tax records get out. But otherwise, essentially tax records are being held back. That's ridiculous. Of course we should see those. And in addition, there was a historian, William Manchester, who did a book called Death of a President. He interviewed Jacqueline Kennedy. His notes with her are sealed entirely because the Kennedy family had requested that. But they're at the National Archives. Those should be available. So I think that we're going to get some documents out that will be embarrassing to the CIA about things that they were doing in the 60s that may have nothing to do with the assassination, but they were still doing illegal things on some place trying to overthrow a leader of a country or whatever else. And then we're going to get some personal files as well about, Jackie Kennedy and tax records.
At 30 minutes after the hour, you're listening to The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is the one and only Gerald Posner. Gerald, you mentioned that Trump assassination attempt. In July, you wrote an essay for the New York Times, headline, "The Government Has Failed America Since the Trump Shooting." Since that essay, there's been a second Trump assassination attempt. Tell me exactly how the government has failed America since that first Trump shooting.
Yeah, the government failed, and I wasn't, there was a terrible dereliction of duty at the first Trump shooting in terms of Butler. I call it the largest dereliction of duty by the Secret Service I've ever seen in terms of just incompetence and gross negligence. But the negligence or the failure that I was talking about and writing about in the New York Times was the failure to keep the American people informed about what was happening. And Frank, we get a storm, you get Sandy hits New York years ago, or you get a major earthquake in California, or you get a mass shooting, and we are accustomed to seeing FEMA or police officials or FBI hold press conferences starting on that first day, and then they say, oh, by the way, there are things we can't answer because it's an ongoing investigation, but let me tell you what we have. And they do that. And in the first shooting, they didn't even have a press conference. They didn't hold it at all. Instead, the head of the Secret Service, who had to then resign, was called up to Capitol Hill, only went because she was subpoenaed, and then sort of stonewalled them all day. So if you want the American people who already are suspicious about government, we know Watergate and the lies about Vietnam and Iran-Contra and everything else, and you start to stonewall people and not disclose information, no wonder many people I spoke to thought there was something more to it. So that's the failure. And I don't mean by that if they held press conferences around the clock and they were more forthcoming, that there still wouldn't be some people with conspiracy theories and whatever else. I get that. But at least you would put a dampener on it. Full information helps kill a lot of what I call the wild conspiracy stuff that takes place on the social media in about 30 seconds at the end of an event.
Yeah, no, well said. Well said. That's such an important point. Sunshine can not only be the best disinfectant at times, but it can be the best sense of reassurance or to cause any of this unfounded skepticism to go away. I caught a column that you wrote in the New York Post asking the question, what's riding on Kamala Harris's answer to a simple question, what is a woman? Obviously, this was a question that a lot of conservatives raised in terms of opposing the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. What do you mean by this when you talk about Kamala Harris's answer to that question, what's a woman?
Yeah, I must give credit to my wife, Tricia, who has sort of zeroed me in on this particular issue, because when I used to hear, they asked this in British politics a lot, and she happens to be British. They had actually a website. They asked all of the people running for prime minister and for parliament recently on a website, what is a woman? They wanted answers for it. And I would say to Tricia, it seems like a trick question, even when Ketanji Brown was asked in her hearings. And Tricia's point is, at stake is, depending on your answer, is Title IX, which is the sort of protection of women's and girls' sports more than anything else in discrimination. Because if your answer to what is a woman is that it's more than biology, you say biology is sort of outdated, it's not just men and women anymore, you can identify as another gender by just saying, I believe I'm a woman. Then you allow men who identify as women into women's sports, and it's the end of women's sports. So it's a technical question that seems like you said, right, a conservative trick of sorts, but it has substance writing behind it. And I think that it's not going to determine the election by any means, because in public opinion polls, people seem remarkably uninterested in it. I don't think they realize the potential ramifications from it. And it's just a question for, and the reason I say Kamala Harris is because she's only the second woman in history to have the nomination of a major political party. So I know this may sound dated for me to say, but as a woman, as a biological woman, she has a real stake in that answer. And clearly, a lot of women are voting for her. There's a gender gap, as you know, in the presidential race.
Oh, yeah.
She has a large lead among women, largely because of reproductive rights. So questions about, abortion and everything else, women are on fire about that in large numbers, but they aren't focused on the issue of, are we going to protect the hard-won rights of women over the decades, like Title IX, by making sure that there are single-sex spaces, that you can't, in California, Harris's home state, men who are serving prison sentences, and I've written about this, including for sex crimes, can identify as a woman and be transferred to a women's-only jail.
Incredible.
That seems a little crazy to me, right?
More than a little, I'd say. If you're just tuning in, I'm Frank Morano. This is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is investigative journalist and best-selling author Gerald Posner.
If you're having problems with your septic system and you're tired of spending so much money each year to have it pumped, then SeptiClean is the answer for you. SeptiClean is an advanced specially formulated blend of bacteria used in the treatment of home and commercial septic systems. The breakdown of waste in your system relies on biological activity of naturally occurring bacteria. SeptiClean restores the natural biological process in your septic system and boosts the existing biological activity. SeptiClean is completely safe on all plumbing and can help prevent expensive emergencies in pumping. SeptiClean has approximately 6 to 100 times the bacteria count of other leading off-the-shelf brands in a 1-year supply. SeptiClean comes in a water-soluble pack, which you flush down the toilet once a month with no mess or stress. Save time, money, and maintenance on your septic system. Find SeptiClean at Emporium True Value Hardware on Main Street in Sag Harbor, or visit micro-tab.com. That's micro-tabb.com. Micro-tabb.com.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel or that white chocolate mocha. Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
This episode is brought to you by Hulu, presenting Paradise. Paradise is Hulu's critically acclaimed addictive drama series, starring Sterling K. Brown, Julianne Nicholson, and James Marsden. The Daily Beast calls Paradise your next TV obsession, and the New York Times says it's exhilarating in all the right ways. Paradise is for your Emmy consideration in all categories, including Outstanding Drama Series. For more information, visit fyc.hulu.com.
This episode is brought to you by Factor. Optimize your nutrition this year with Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal service. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved, ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from 40 weekly options across 8 dietary preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Eat smarter at factormeals.com/listen50 and use code listen50 for 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Factormeals.com/listen50, code listen50. T's and C's apply.
Gerald, I was reading your Just the Facts Substack, and you had this incredible article all about your 40-year hunt for the records of the Nazi doctor Mengele. Now, I think a lot of people in our audience know who Mengele is, but for the folks that don't, take us back. I know you wrote the book on Mengele 24 years ago, Mengele, The Complete Story, really comprehensive. Give us a thumbnail sketch of who Dr. Mengele was.
Yeah, he was a 33-year-old physician who was like top of his medical class, a Nazi doctor who was sent to the largest concentration camp. And there he did the cruelest types of human experimentation, primarily on children. He specialized in finding twins who arrived at the concentration camp. He would pull them aside. And at his peak, Frank, he had 5,000 children he was experimenting on, trying to create a master race, injecting their eyes with dyes to turn brown eyes blue, and putting all types of solvents and different things into them. And when the war ended, he escaped. He got away, and then he went to South America, and he was probably the #1 Nazi fugitive in the 1960s and 70s and 80s that people were looking for. Never found. He died while he was swimming off of Brazil. And here's the issue that came up. Two twins came to me when I was still practicing law back in the early 80s, and they said, there are only about 100 twins alive at that time. We spend thousands of dollars a year with doctors to deaden the pain for what was done to us at this concentration camp by this doctor who's called the Angel of Death. We don't know how to treat it because we're not quite sure what he did to us. But we think that he took his records with him. And there was, in the post-war testimonies, an inmate doctor who said, yeah, he came the night that he left and fled, and he took this briefcase with him. Well, 40 years after the end of the war, I came across his personal diaries and his letters. His son had produced them. And in those diaries that he kept after the war, we find out that he had actually kept his lab notes, some specimens from the lab. He took them with him to South America, and that became the holy grail that I was looking for, because I was hoping to find it and to be able to give the twins some answers as to what this madman had done to them in the concentration camp, so they might be able to get some treatment for it. And it still remains a mystery.
Well, there's been some interesting progress on your 40-year quest in that regard, but when people hear about what you just described, these experiments on children and the really cruel way that you experiment on human beings at a concentration camp, a lot of folks, myself included, are going to wonder, why did he do this? Now, I know for that book back in 2000, you studied everything that was available written on him and written about him. Do you have a conclusion as to why he did this? Did he do this out of loyalty to Hitler? Was it ideological? Was it some other reason? Why did he do it?
No. Believe it or not, I know this will sound, for people who haven't studied it, incredible. He did it for ambition and because he really believed it. He went to medical school when the Nazis were teaching their idea of racial superiority. So he went to medical school at a time when they really believed that there was a superior race, that you could find that there were inferior races by looking at them. And he thought once the war came around, he served on the Eastern Front when they were fighting in Russia. He got wounded. He gets an Iron Cross. And then he wants to go to Auschwitz. He's heard about this concentration camp. And one of the senior medical researchers in Berlin gives it to him as a plum assignment, because for Mengele, this is a research laboratory. And I say that and people cringe, but you have to think of it from the perspective of a mad doctor who has no moral compass. He doesn't have to do his research in a Petri dish or based upon a couple of what's in test tubes. He can actually take human beings and find twins, do experiments on one and keep the others what they call a control. He justified it in his mind by saying these people were going to die anyway. They'd been sent to a death camp. They were going to be gassed. I pulled them aside and experimented on them. The only reason they're alive after the war is because I had saved their lives. He'd actually turned this horrendous act of medical experimentation into, like, you should have thanked me. And when his son challenged him, his only son, who met him once as an adult, challenged him about Auschwitz, he was hoping his father would say, oh, terrible assignment. I did it because, we had to. They would kill me if I didn't do it. And instead, his father says, he's 66 years old, Joseph Mengele, when he meets his son in Brazil. And he says, don't ever question me about Auschwitz. You'll never understand what we were doing. We were at the forefront of science. We were going to change history. He thought he could unlock the secrets as to why women have twin births. No one knows why an egg splits into two and women have two children instead of one at a birth. He thought if he could unlock that secret, that after the war, every good German mother could have two children instead of one, and he could replenish the German war debt at a faster rate. So you're really talking about the ultimate mad scientist let loose on children in the concentration camp who gets away with it.
He made decisions about who would be gassed immediately, who would be worked to death, who would serve as involuntary guinea pigs for some of the experiments that you're describing. How did he make his decisions about who would fall into each of those categories?
So at Auschwitz, the SS doctors, of which he was one, would go to the railhead when the trains, the cattle cars, packed with people who had been rounded up in different areas in Hungary in 1944 and parts of Poland, from Czechoslovakia, crammed in. Those trains would arrive in the middle of the night. The lights would be turned on at the railhead at Auschwitz. There would be dogs barking. The cars would be opened up. Some people would have died on the train journey there. And those people who then came out would be told to get into two lines, men and women. Families would be separated. Children were almost always sent, as for the elderly, to be gassed because they only wanted working people. If they had the need for working people, slave labor at IG Farben and Bayer Aspirin and that just down the road at a camp called Monowitz. So they needed slave labor, but they were looking for able-bodied people. And Mengele would make sure that he would send the elderly to their death, and sometimes it would send the women to their death if they have too many women in the camp. But he would pull the children out, especially the twins. That's what he was looking for all the time.
You mentioned this 40-year hunt for his records and what motivates you and your representation of the twins and your hope that you could find out what was done to them. What are the recent developments on this? It seems like almost something that could be in an Indiana Jones movie. It's taking you to Buenos Aires, all these meetings with priests and researching seminaries. And what's the latest with what you've done here in this 40-year hunt for his records?
The latest is this summer. Just a few months ago, I found a priest who had served in an Argentine seminary that closed years ago. And that seminary was a Franciscan priest who had ended up helping Nazis after the war and was rumored to have had the suitcase from Mengele. So I'm trying to go down that path. But you're absolutely right. In other times, I've been in Argentina, I've been in Paraguay, I've been in Uruguay. I met with a fellow, it's hard to believe his name, Wilfred von Oven, who was an assistant to Adolf Eichmann and ran a neo-Nazi newspaper after the war in Buenos Aires. He knew Mengele, and sort of, that proved to be a dead end. I met with a fellow called Hans Rudel, who was Hitler's most decorated pilot in the war. He had lost one leg. He helped the Nazis escape after the war, but they always kept you away from information about Mengele because he was one of the big notable figures that they went out of their way to protect. And I didn't know this, Frank, until I got down to the first time I was in South America was 1984, 2 years before the book was first published. And I will tell you that in that first trip in 1984, I discovered that there's a cottage industry in Nazis. There was at least then, 40 years ago. You say as a journalist, I'm interested in Mengele, and you will find people that say, oh, Mengele, I went bowling with him like 6 months ago.
Wow.
Or my kid knew him, and, skiing in Bariloche. It's all junk. But people try to attach themselves to some mythic, evil figure because it makes them somehow feel more important. And so you realize that 90% of what you're told is garbage. You have to go through that and sift through it. But you have to look at it all because there might actually be something worthwhile.
Wow. Lastly, Gerald, I know years ago you wrote Citizen Perot, a biography of Ross Perot. One of the things that I sort of roll my eyes whenever I hear people say about the 1992 presidential election is, and it's almost instinctive. They say it's like Pavlov's dog, is that Ross Perot caused the election of Bill Clinton. I'm sure you've looked at that 1992 election much more closely than I ever have. Can you state one way or another whether that's true or not? Did Ross Perot's candidacy in 92 elect Bill Clinton?
Absolutely not. And I tell you, Frank, and it's not just me saying that as an opinion. You're right. Everybody, when I talk about Perot, says, "Oh God, the guy who elected Clinton."
Right.
And this is why I say it's not true. They did exit polling, all the extensive exit polling, and I've been through it. It's hundreds of pages long. The exit polls after the 92 election show that Perot drew evenly in his 20% from Bush and from Clinton. There was no state in which he drew so much away from Bush that it made the difference on Clinton winning the state. He was an equal opportunity sort of, candidate. And the Clinton would have won the race without him. He won it with a lower, popular vote with him in it. But it was not Perot who put Clinton in the White House.
Gerald Posner, it's always a treat to talk with you. I hope we can do this again soon. If people are interested in the opioid epidemic, especially the role of the Sacklers and the role of Big Pharma, I do recommend strongly your book, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. And if they check out your Substack, that's a must-read for me whenever something new is published. It's called Just the Facts. Thank you, Gerald.
Thanks so much, Frank. It's always great to talk with you. Thanks.
If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, feel free to do so. 646-720-0635. That's 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.
If you're having problems with your septic system and you're tired of spending so much money each year to have it pumped, then SeptiClean is the answer for you. SeptiClean is an advanced specially formulated blend of bacteria used in the treatment of home and commercial septic systems. The breakdown of waste in your system relies on biological activity of naturally occurring bacteria. SeptiClean restores the natural biological process in your septic system and boosts the existing biological activity. SeptiClean is completely safe on all plumbing and can help prevent expensive emergencies in pumping. SeptiClean has approximately 6 to 100 times the bacteria count of other leading off-the-shelf brands in a 1-year supply. SeptiClean comes in a water-soluble pack, which you flush down the toilet once a month with no mess or stress. Save time, money, and maintenance on your septic system. Find SeptiClean at Emporium True Value Hardware on Main Street in Sag Harbor or visit micro-tab.com. That's micro-tabb.com. Micro-tabb.com.